Hello and welcome to Business Today. I am Siddharth Zarabi and with me today a very special guest, Sanjeev Sanyal, the former Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance and now a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Sanjeev, a very warm welcome to Business Today. Thank you for your time. We are talking at a time when the latest inflation numbers in India as well as the United States have sent various signals to the markets and the broader economy. Starting with your views on India's inflation and where it stands and how it's looking to you in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, the latest print for the Indian inflation, consumer price inflation, has come out at about 7%, as you know. This is outside of the 2 to 6% range, which the Monetary Policy Committee is supposed to target. So in that sense, clearly it is outside of our comfort zone. But I would like to highlight the international context in which this is happening. As you're aware, international commodity prices, particularly energy prices, have been elevated now for some time. And although they have come down a little bit on the margin, they are still very elevated now. And this is feeding through to inflation globally. Virtually every developed economy is seeing record-breaking inflation. Many emerging markets are seeing inflation running into 70–80%, I mean, countries like Turkey, for example. So in that context, I would argue that India is doing rather well. This is not to suggest that we are not concerned about it. Obviously, we want to maintain this macroeconomic stability that we have earned through hard work. I mean, introducing that inflation targeting framework, when we did that in the years 16, 17, 18, we had to earn that macroeconomic stability. We're enjoying that now, but we wouldn't want the cat to come out of the bag. So given that context, I would argue that we will be quite, as far as possible, using as responsible tools we can, keep that control. Now, of course, I can't speak for the Monetary Policy Committee, but I think there is a consensus that, responsible macroeconomic management is key roots to our economic management overall.
Sanjeev, you spoke about what happened to energy pricing across the world and consumers in the West who have never seen energy prices and food prices like this. It's like a second oil shock, only it's playing out in a different way and for different reasons. How is India compared to other economies when it comes to the outlook for inflation? There are 2 points of view. One says that perhaps the worst is now behind us and therefore fears of a global recession have receded. The other says you don't know what would happen next 2–3 months and there seems to be a bit of skittishness in the markets as a result.
Well, of course, I am in no position to predict how exactly Russia will or will not supply energy to Europe. So that is the immediate context. But let me say that, of course, India as an energy importer, at least for the foreseeable future, will be impacted by whatever happens out of that cycle. But there is a bigger story here beyond just the immediate shock from oil prices, but also from droughts. Incidentally, food prices are also being influenced by or will be influenced by droughts in Europe, in China, and so on. So there are these immediate concerns. But I think there is a bigger concern in the rest of the world, particularly in the West, in that they have not done the kinds of supply-side measures needed to keep the productive side of the economy going. And you will remember the many debates that we had during the COVID period, where economists like myself had been making the point that, look, the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. It will have its own dynamics, its own technologies, its own supply chains, its own many other things. So in that context, you have got to maintain supply-side measures. You've got to keep investing in infrastructure and so on, and not use up all your ammunition in sending demand or more specifically consumption stoking measures alone.
Packets of money?
Absolutely. Stimulus.
Helicopter money.
Helicopter money of various kinds. So they've used up their ammunition, have not spent it on creating supply-side capacities. They've not done any supply-side reforms. I mean, you look at some of their, variety of their sort of systems, so to speak, economic systems, policies, etc. They're all outdated and they have not been keeping up with it. And contrast that with what we have been doing over many years. Even before COVID, we were doing serious supply-side measures, GST, cleaning up the banks, insolvency and bankruptcy code, the inflation targeting framework itself. But even during COVID, we continued to do reforms. We opened up the drone sector. We opened up the geospatial sector. We removed all kinds of outdated regulations from the BPO sector, from the telecoms side. We opened up trade finance in multiple ways. So we have kept doing supply-side measures, as a result of which our supply side is now vastly superior. So coming back to the point about inflation. Yes, we have some amount of this imported inflation problem, but our supply side is in good shape. Our core inflation, the underlying inflation of our system, is not a concern. I am not so sure about the West. Even if you did not have these immediate concerns, their economic systems simply are not in a position to grow at any rapid rate without being able to generate other forms of inflation, whether I mean, they have shortages like in the UK, I mean, even the US, there are shortages of manpower in skilled areas, including truck drivers in many cases. So I'm just pointing out to you that the supply side matters.
The supply side matters. In the Indian context, therefore, do you think inflation has peaked out?
Well, domestically driven inflation has peaked out. Core inflation has peaked out. But can I make some statement about what will happen to energy prices abroad? No. Will we be immune, given that we are a major importer of many commodities? Are we immune to global trends? No. There will also perhaps be some turbulence to food prices given the droughts around the world. And even in India, we have had uneven rainfall.
And heat waves which have impacted wheat production, for example.
Yes, and you know, we have comfortable food stocks at home, but you know, we can't be immune to what will happen in the rest of the world if China suddenly needs to buy a large amount of extra rice. So, point I'm making to you is we are not immune to the rest of the world. Disruptions in production, say in Europe, from you know, blackouts over winter, for example, that will have an impact on us. I mean, we import chips and all kinds of parts and machinery from, say, Germany and other parts of Europe. Those could get disrupted. So what I'm trying to say is we are a part of the world. We cannot be immune to that. But let me say that India is part of the solution. Our supply side has been consistently supplying to the rest of the world things that it needs, whether it's, of course, the vaccines and pharmaceuticals is something, of course, we saw during the COVID period. But I think we will increasingly find that, you know, the deployment of Indian products and services is a key part of tempering inflation in the world, not just in India. I mean, many of the things are being many of the back offices now, increasingly middle offices, even front offices are being outsourced to India from the West, particularly Western Europe. That is key to keeping their costs going. I mean, airlines like Lufthansa and British Airways and all these airlines couldn't keep going unless they had large back offices here in India.
Fair enough. There is also some commentary about our food grain stocks being at multi-year lows, primarily on account of the fact that we also are providing additional support through the continuation of the Pradhan Mantri Anna Kalyan Yojana. Is that a matter of concern? Because I picked up some chatter that, oh, our food grain stocks are low, and there's also some political commentary on it, but we leave the politics aside. As an economist, do you think this is a matter of concern?
So, we have now for many years had food grain stocks far in excess of what is the norms that we had given to ourselves. And till not so long ago, the discussion used to be about how much wastage is happening, it's getting diverted to the alcohol industry and so on. So in that context, I would say that, look, maybe it has come off from the peak. But is it the case that it's inadequate? No, I think it's still reasonably adequate. And although we ourselves, this monsoon has been quite a rough journey for many parts of the country.
Pretty erratic.
Very erratic. I believe, however, in the very end, it is now, there's some heavier rain happening in the eastern part of the country, which had a drought situation. But nevertheless, I don't think it's unfair to say that we should expect the harvest to have been, at least in some parts of the country, to have been affected. Do we have enough food stocks to be able to sort of ride through that? Yes, we do.
Your assessment of Atmanirbhar initiatives, now I'm talking about the broad thing because you've also been involved in that. How Atmanirbhar is the Indian economy 2 years after we started going down that route? Your broad stroke sense of where we stand today.
So first of all, let me clarify what we mean by Atmanirbhar. Very often it's taken to suggest that we are trying to go back to socialist era import substitution. Not at all the case. This is
a former RBI governor is also critical of the production linked incentive scheme, for example, just to interrupt you.
So I think, well, that is an incentive towards scaling, including for export purposes. So that's a completely different issue. But let me talk about Atmanirbharta. And the key thing to understand about Atmanirbharta is about resilience and clustering effects. In other words, leveraging our domestic strengths, whether it's our market or our engineering or natural resources, whatever may be the case, in order to have a minimum clustering of activity where either our competitiveness is something that can be enhanced or the resilience of our economy can be enhanced. So for example, critical inputs into our pharmaceuticals industry, they can't be totally reliant on single source foreign supplier. So in all those areas where some amount of protection may be needed, that I think is not an unfair way of thinking about it. We have seen over the last 2 years global supply chains do get disrupted, and protecting our interests is not an unreasonable thing to do. It's a common sense thing to do. This is not to suggest that we try to go back to having this, as I said, 1960s or 1970s view of import substitution. That is not the case. Nobody wants to go back to driving around in ambassador cars. But protecting our interests systematically is something we will do. And this we will do even when we are entering into foreign trade pacts. For example, we did not enter into the RCEP because we judged that it wasn't in our interest. This doesn't mean that we are against foreign trade pacts. We are obviously going ahead and signing with other countries. We have already done with UAE, with Australia. We are in serious discussions with the UK, which hopefully will get done before the end of this year, and so on. So this is a very different approach. Now, talking about the PLI scheme, well, the PLI scheme is certainly a different kind of innovation given our history. Historically, we have had some sort of an internal bias about scaling up and eulogizing sort of industrial midgets. So I think we have moved away from that and sort of understood that scale matters. Our domestic market allows us to create scale. This is good for employment, but it is also good for global competitiveness. I mean, at the end, if you want to compete in the world and be able to deliver in scale, then you need scale. That is basically what the PLI scheme is. It's a one-time sort of incentive to allow Indian industry to reach international global scales. And some industries have been selected for doing that. Is it a use of industrial policy? Yes, it is. Is it a return to socialist era import substitution? Absolutely not.
Why is Raghuram Rajan critical of the PLI then?
Well, you should ask him.
Okay, we'll try that. Let's come to another good news today, which is the massive investment announced, and it's a big one by Vedanta and Foxconn to do a semiconductor display fab and assembly and testing unit. $20 billion will take some time to get off the ground. There are other proposals also in the pipeline. How significant is this, Sanjeev, especially because the 70s had seen a start in semiconductor manufacturing in India, and we were pretty neck to neck with even Taiwan, but we lost out on the race.
Well, I can't go back and look at the 1970s. The fact of the matter is there are many good reasons why we do need to be in there, not the least because now semiconductors, chips and those kinds of things are an input into virtually everything. So just like with critical inputs into pharmaceuticals, this is a critical input into the digital economy, and we do need to have some capacity in it. I'm not saying we'll replace the rest of the world, but we do need some capacity here. And so we are, we do want them here. The governments, both central and the relevant state governments, have put in the effort to try and attract this. And this is a part of both being at the cutting edge of technology, but also part of our resilience plan, and therefore very much in that Atmanirbhar scheme of things. By the way, the Americans are doing the same thing, as you may be aware, trying to reshore these things for exactly the same reasons, incidentally. So I hope some of the non-resident Indian economists based in the US who dislike our PLI schemes and so on, are raising their objections in their country of residence.
What about the new global supply order? For the last 3 decades, the world and even India believed in the relevance of global supply chains, just-in-time, outsourced manufacturing. We are seeing a reversal to that, and a realization that you can't just trust one single country, which, by the way, not only is been problematic for India on its borders, but also globally as well. Is there a new reckoning? And Sanjeev, I ask you this as someone who has tracked not just present, but even historical trade ties of India with other nations.
Absolutely. And again, just like India has to care about resilience, so do global supply chains and other economies in the world. And one of the things we found out through this last few years, whether it's the war or COVID or the tensions in East Asia, that an interconnected world is also susceptible to breakdowns. And if your entire sort of business model is based on a single source or a single kind of supply chain, then obviously you are susceptible to that breaking down and breaking down everything as a result. The old story, the battle is lost for the want of a nail. So in that context, India has a very big value proposition. We are one of the few countries in the world who can do scale in China kind of scale in terms of our domestic market, the amount of labor we can bring to the table, our engineering capacities and so on, and increasingly our infrastructure, which historically may have lagged behind, but I think increasingly we are able to create airports, ports, highways in global quality. So given that context, and of course given our own domestic market, which is itself attractive in its own right, I think we are making a big pitch to be a part of the global supply chain and part of a global solution.
Sanjeev, over the last 2 years, China +1, and that +1 being India, has been spoken about at global forums. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, pretty much every conversation that I was part of, this did come up. Do you agree with China +1, even if you sort of dislike the formulation because it kind of doesn't seem to be right? But is India an alternative for global manufacturing, global capital versus our neighbor?
First of all, we are already critical to the global services trade. And do remember, even in manufacturing, a significant part of the manufacturing is actually about the design, the logistics, and so on. And a lot of it is already done in India. So if we can design a chip, why can't we also do the next step in manufacturing? if he can design a car, if he can design all kinds of electronic products and so on, I don't think we are incapable of actually taking the next step and producing it. And we are seeing a lot of interest. FDI has clearly been strong over the last few years, even through the COVID period. So I think, we are capable, and even at the margin, we can see our own domestic manufacturers, the sort of energy is coming back in some ways. You can see credit growth picking up in recent months. So I think we are in good shape. Financial markets have repeatedly shown resilience and the capacity to fund all this. And of course, we are now the world's third largest startup ecosystem, suggesting that its innovation and entrepreneurship is very much bubbling in this country.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the final part and your assessment of growth just beyond the headline numbers. Numbers get revised. Our GDP is restated 3-4 times. Inflation numbers get revised. But your assessment about an economy where a lot of people said that it's moving in two separate directions. The weaker part, the unorganized part, the informal sector, the MSME sector is suffering, whereas the larger organized companies have benefited from digitization, have benefited from the post-COVID bounce back in consumption, and this is now becoming a strain, including parts of the rural economy, Sanjeev.
So first, let me say that this sort of 1970s rhetoric, big business is somehow in competition with small business, may be true in certain segments. Maybe there are certain industries where that happens, but for the most part, do remember that big business and small business are hardly in competition. They're mostly in sync and complementary to each other. Most small businesses supply to or use products from large businesses. Even a small kirana shop is ultimately selling soaps and biscuits and other things from large companies. So I think, first of all, let's get away from this idea that their relationship is mostly of some sort of a competitive one, and that one of them growing is somehow bad for the other end of the spectrum. What matters in the end is that the whole ecosystem of industry grows. If that happens, then including large industry grows, and the whole supply chain tightens up. It benefits everybody. GST grows. The whole system formalizes. It's a good thing for everybody. And that formalization is happening. It's a good thing even for small industry to formalize. And we have given all kinds of incentives to allow that to happen. So my argument, as far as the medium-term growth prospects of this country is concerned, I think our supply side, having done years now of reforms, and some very difficult reforms, our supply side is in perhaps the best shape of any major economy in the world. We are, even under very difficult circumstances, we are hitting about a 7% odd GDP growth rate. But I would argue that if we, say, get clear roads, as, say, you got between 2003 and 2006, you had a phase where international situation was particularly conducive, Goldilocks kind of period, then this economy can grow at 9%. Now, can I predict that whether we win and if we will get that kind of a phase? No. But I'm just pointing out to you that our economy is capable of that kind of thing. So we have a very good, robust car. The engine is in good nick. We have a good driver in place. Now, of course, I can't predict the condition of the roads, and I wouldn't advise pressing the accelerator too hard till we get a good patch. But even with this rough patch, we are managing to do 7% growth. That is far in excess of any other comparable economy in the world. I mean, China, or certainly Europe is probably going to recession, but even China is nowhere in that same range of growth. So we are clearly doing very well, and doing it without our macroeconomic fundamentals going off kilter. I mean, even on the inflation front, yeah, it's above what we would like it to be. But given the conditions and what's happening in the rest of the world, I think we have managed our macroeconomic stability indicators rather well. So I think we are in good shape. I would advise against unnecessarily throwing that out of the window, trying to force growth through this. I would say this is a good rate. Compounding is a good thing. And if we get a clean patch, we can probably grow at 9% or more.
And that's perhaps the best way to end this interview, because 9% would be something which would benefit all Indians as growth trickles down. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you very much for your time with us today. That was Sanjeev Sanyal, the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, talking about inflation, growth, and the state of India's economy, with the hope that it will soon touch 9% annual growth. If you've been, thank you very much for watching.